Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years. And today we are in Revelation chapter 8. This is our 8th week in the book of Revelation. Now, little recap. Revelation chapter 1, of course, introduces the book, and we have Jesus coming to John the Revelator, who I'm quite content to think is John the son of Zebedee on the island of Patmos. And we realize that this book is a revelation. It's an apocalypsis, which is a particular kind of document in which a heavenly, otherworldly being, in this case Jesus, comes to an important earthly figure, in this case John the Revelator, and opens up both time and space for John the Revelator to see. In an apocalypse, we see into heaven, which is another spatial realm, but we also see into the future. We see things that are soon to come. And so the book of Revelation is also a prophecy, not just an apocalypse. Then in chapters 2 and 3, of course, we have real churches. It is a letter. The book of Revelation partakes of 3 genres. It is an apocalypse, it is a prophecy, it is a letter to 7 churches. And there are 7 angels that are associated with these 7 churches in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. Chapters 4 and 5 then form the very core of the book. This is where we actually get into heaven itself. The throne room is open. John the Revelator is able to see in chapter 4 God the Father and the 24 elders and the 4 beasts crying, "Holy, holy, holy," to God the Father. They also want to know, well, who is worthy to open the scroll? This scroll represents the beginning of setting everything right, and of course the end of setting everything right. Also, it represents the judgment and the restoration of all things. And no one is found in heaven worthy to open the scroll other than the Lamb of God, which is, of course, Jesus, the Lamb that was slain. And we read about that in chapter 5. There are 7 seals on this scroll, seals of wax, I assume. And as the Lamb opens each scroll, then in chapter 6, we begin to have kind of the turbulence that precedes the judgment. Now, of course, they did not realize at that time that it would be 2,000 years at least before Jesus returned. And so we don't take these as literal events, the 4 horsemen, don't say, there's a famine, but these are the kind of symbolic portents of the judgment that is to come. And so in my mind, and again, I don't claim to have all the answers to the book of Revelation, but in my mind, chapter 6 represents foreshadowings that, throughout all of time, as it were, the foreshadowings of the final restoration of all things. And we get through 6 of the seals in chapter 6. 6 and 6. Of course, the chapters were added much later in the Middle Ages. But we get to then chapter 7. And in chapter 7, which we did last week, we see this great company of heaven. It is a company of all those who have been rescued out of times of great tribulation. These are all the Christians throughout the ages who have been saved. I'm not sure, I don't think I said this last week, I'm not sure that in chapter 7 we are meant to imagine any of the saints of the Old Testament. For example, it seems to me that those, and I could be wrong again, Revelation is highly debated, but it seems to me that what we are seeing in chapter 7 are all of those who have been saved from the church age, all the time in between Jesus' ascension to heaven and his final coming. We also see 144,000 Israelites, which people debate whether that's basically another way of saying those from every tribe and nation, or whether it is singling out actual Jews who are saved in the church age. I lean toward it being literally ethnic Jews who believe on Jesus Christ, or perhaps, of course, Paul says in Romans 11 that all Israel will be saved. So perhaps it represents some sort of a revival of Israel. We'll know when it happens, won't we? As with all of these things. But it seems to me that chapter 7 pictures those who are redeemed throughout the time between Christ's resurrection and his final judgment. And there is indeed, unto the ends of the earth, the gospel has gone. And that's where we find ourselves as we enter Revelation chapter 8, because now there is one last seal to be broken. And when this final seal is broken by the Lamb, the judgment proper will begin. Verse 1, and whenever he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. So the judgment is now about to begin. Of course, if we were to connect this with other parts of the New Testament, and of course we need to let each part of the New Testament speak on its own, but I do see, as I try to integrate the very highly symbolic revelation with other passages, there is, of course, 1 Thessalonians 4, where the dead in Christ shall rise first, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up to meet them in the air. Well, that's somewhat Revelation chapter 7, isn't it? Where basically the redeemed and those who are to be saved have been rescued and snatched, as it were. And now the judgment is going to begin. And in 1 Corinthians 6, 2 and 3, we participate in the judgment. In other words, this rapture or this snatching up to meet in the air is not for us then to go on vacation, but it is the alignment of all those as the judgment begins. And I think we should see in Revelation 8 a picture of the beginning of the final judgment. Now, in my opinion, it's not a literal picture. It's not and here we are, we're on the second trumpet. It's not that kind of an approach. It's a kind of a kaleidoscopic kind of picture of things, and it's not linear. So it's a little like in Wayne's World. Let's do the next picture. These are different pictures, all of which basically, the bottom line is we don't want to be on the earth side of things during the judgment. We want to be part of the saved group in the judgment. Now, by the way, it's not in chapter 8, but at the end of chapter 9, we at least get the impression that if those who are enduring the judgment, if those who are enduring the judgment would have repented, they might have also been saved. Now, again, we don't want to read too much into this because it's highly symbolic. However, I take great hope in the fact that even at the end of chapter 9, there seems to be the possibility, at least, that if those who are experiencing the final judgment would have repented, that they would also perhaps have been saved. Well, so the silence is over, half hour done, verse 2. And I saw the seven angels who have stood before God, and they were given to them 7 trumpets. Now, again, the number 7 is not, it's symbolic because, of course, there are more than 7 churches. There are 7 churches that are the direct recipients of the book of Revelation, but of course, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of churches. So it's a symbolic, it reminds us that this is symbolic. It is not exactly the way things are going to happen. It's much more of a picture. Verse 3, and another angel came and stood upon the altar, having a golden censer, and was given to him much incense, so that he will give with the prayers of all the saints upon the altar, upon the golden altar, which is before the throne. We've had basically this heavenly altar seems to represent how the prayers of the saints come to God. Of course, we've had the martyrs under the altar saying, how long, O Lord, and who is worthy? There are things that these prayers. And so I wonder if what we are to take from this is the fact that now, finally, the prayers of those asking, where is judgment? How long? When will righteousness be served? That now is finally the time when that is going to happen. Verse 4, and the smoke of the incense by the prayers of the saints went up from the hand of the angel before God. So finally, we're going to have justice. Now, mercy was always available, and as I said, is still available, but now is the time for justice. Verse 5, and the angel took the censer and filled it from the fire of the altar and cast it to the earth. And there came to be thunders and sounds and flashes and an earthquake. So let the judgment begin. We start off in chapter 8 with 4 trumpets. There are 3 more trumpets as we go on, but it's a little bit similar with the seals. Remember, the first 4 seals involved the 4 horsemen, and then there were 3 more. And so here we have the first 4 trumpets, and then at the end of this chapter, there's a kind of taking stock of the first 4 trumpets, and it gets worse, of course, as it goes along. So verse 6, and the 7 angels, the ones having the 7 trumpets, they prepared themselves that they might sound the trumpet. Verse 7. And the first sounded. So we have the first, and you'll notice that I have Albrecht Dürer's, one of his woodcuts of the 7 angels behind me, if you're watching the video. And so the first trumpet sounded, the first angel sounded, and there came hail, and fire having been mixed with blood. That's a scary image, isn't it? And it was cast upon the land, and a third of the land was burned up, and a third of the trees was burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Again, this is not a literal, probably not a literal picture, but we're getting an image here of great devastation. The judgment has begun. Verse 8, and the second angel sounded, and like a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. You know, again, I don't think we should say, oh, there's going to be a meteor that's going to go into the sea. I mean, of course, God can do whatever God wants. Perhaps there'll be something like that. These are images. They're pictures. What's important to take from it is the feel of it, not the specifics of it. And there became a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures in the sea died. That is, those in the sea that had life, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And so not just the land, but also the sea. So we're seeing the parts of the creation undergoing a kind of sympathetic judgment. You know, it's not that the trees have sinned. It's not that the water has sinned, although water does usually have this connotation in ancient culture of chaos and of kind of it's not a good image of the sea. But there is a sympathy between the creation groans for redemption with us, and the creation, there will be a new creation, but the old creation will be removed, and that is part of what this I think symbolizes here. Verse 10, and the third angel sounded his trumpet, and fell from the sky a great star, burning like a lamp, and it fell upon a third of the rivers, and upon the springs of the waters. So now we have the waters that are inland. Verse 11, and the name of the star is called absinthos, absinthe, wormwood. This is a bitter plant, absinthe. And it became a third of the waters into absinthe, into wormwood. And many of the people, that is, died from the waters because they were made poisonous, because they were made bitter. Again, this is imagery of the judgment. And the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that the third of them should be darkened, and that day should not appear, the third of it, and the night similarly. I was looking, by the way, in Craig Kester's book, Revelation, the End of All Things, is kind of a commentary of sorts, although not exactly, it doesn't go verse by verse. But he was mentioning that some of these things have already been destroyed, right? The sun has already been darkened, and the moon has already turned to blood, and the grass has already been scorched, and so forth. And he reminds us, and I think this is quite right, that we are not seeing a linear kind of progression here. It's much more of a kaleidoscope, where we get a picture from one side and a picture from another, and then we have and we get another angle of it. None of this is meant to be taken exactly as the way that the judgment will happen. But we have we had the seas, and we had the lands, and now the sky itself is being part of the judgment, as it were, the stars and so forth, and the moon and so forth, the lights and so forth. So we're seeing all the realms of creation. And again, you'll notice that this is the kind of destruction of the world from the perspective of how John pictured it. So John didn't think of there being galaxies in the universe, or there being, I assume that this is a localized judgment. So Alpha Centauri is not being judged in the book of Revelation. That would have been a completely foreign concept to John the Revelation. Distant black holes are not being judged. Again, this is a great debate point. I don't claim to have all the answers, but this would seem to be a localized kind of situation. God is smart. God is going to figure this out. And you hope you know I'm joking. God knows exactly how this is all going to work. Who knows? Maybe the new Earth is actually a different Earth in a different dimension, to where those who say we go to heaven and those who say no, we're going to be on a new Earth, maybe they're both right. Maybe the new Earth is an Earth in another dimension, and not necessarily the physical Earth. I mean, basically, it's a warning to us not to think that we have it all figured out, because let's face it, God is much smarter than the smartest person who's ever lived, and so we have no idea exactly how this is all going to play out. What is our takeaway? Be part of the saved. Don't be part of those who are left for the judgment. Verse 13, and I saw and I heard one eagle. I heard one eagle flying in the middle of the sky. This is an interesting Greek word. The mesuranema, the middle sky. I saw an eagle flying in the middle sky, saying with a great voice, "Woe, woe to those dwelling upon the earth, because the remaining voices of the trumpet of the three angels that are about to sound." So this eagle is basically saying, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you think that the judgment of these first four trumpets was bad, where a third of the sky and a third of the seas and a third of the land were consumed by fire. By the way, you might see 2 Peter 3 also has imagery of the destruction of the world by fire. But this eagle basically says, if you think that this has been bad, you haven't seen what's going to happen when the last three trumpets sound. I might also add here that Bob Mulholland, in his commentary on Revelation, points out that the word for eagle might also be translated vulture. So perhaps we should see this as a vulture crying out. I mean, we associate vultures with dead bodies, and hovering over that which is about to die, or that which has just died. That would be a fairly fitting imagery. I might also say that Mulholland sees the wormwood, the star that has fallen from heaven. Now, of course, stars often were understood in Jewish times to be heavenly beings, and Mulholland suggests that this fallen heavenly being ultimately can be no one but Satan himself, who has fallen to the earth. It's certainly possible. You might know that the Gospel of Luke, where the disciples come back to Jesus and they say, "Lord, even the demons obey us." And Jesus says, "I have seen Satan fall from the sky like lightning." Jesus is not talking about the fall of Satan, in primordial times there. Jesus is saying in Luke that in my ministry, the rule of Satan over the earth is ended, and that Satan has fallen from his status as the prince and power of the air, as Ephesians calls him. And so certainly Mulholland could be right. We're going to see this star again a little bit later on in the book of Revelation. So we'll continue that dialogue when we get there. Well, chapter 8 is a fairly short chapter. In verse 9, we are going to see the images of judgment continue. And again, I'm struck by the fact, you know that people argue over 7-year tribulation and mid-trib and post-trib and pre-trib and that sort of thing. It seems to me that we've already seen the saved in the previous chapter, chapter 7. However, we are going to find next week in chapter 9 that there are some who are able to be saved even during this time of the judgment. So we'll be back, Lord willing, next week to do Revelation chapter 9 in our series Through the Bible in 10 Years.